Hi, welcome to Quackcast 46. I think it's 46. I don't know what numbering system the computer is using. As I've said before, there's an issue with Rapid Weaver renumbering podcasts, which someday, if I have the time, I'm going to abandon entirely. But for the time being, your best bet is to use the RSS feed for iTunes, even if you don't use iTunes, to get the correct numbering. So this is Quackcast number 46. It's a rehash of my science-based medicine blog entry entitled Medical Voices, Always in Error, Never in Doubt. And otherwise, I'm going to skip through the usual nonsense and introduction and get right to the heart of the matter. Prior to this entry, I have written 2 articles on the science-based medicine site in reference to medical voices. One had 9 questions, which I answered. The other was on mumps, or the mumps. There are, I think, 18 web pages of articles about vaccines on that website. I am uncertain as to the true number of pages of information, as the navigation buttons at the bottom of the pages did not always seem to function correctly. That such a problem existed, and I bet you it gets fixed soon, suggests that no one has bothered, like me, to go through the website in an attempt to read all the essays. Or perhaps it's just me and the price I pay for using the Chrome web browser. Anyway, there are a large collection of essays that serve as a rich vein of iron pyrite to mine for topics. At about 5 entries to a page, evaluating at a pace of about 1 a month would take years to analyze all the misinformation on medical voices. So it occurs to me that at the center of each article is a nut of misinformation, or sometimes as many as 9 nuts, that serve as the core fallacy of the article. And I want to emphasize here that I am using nut as a metaphor for seed and not in its other more colloquial meaning. I have no way of knowing if any of the authors of these web pages are indeed nuts. I, of course, have the total irrational opinion that rational thought will sway opinion. I'm a nut in my own way that way, but I cannot speak for others. So rather than an in-depth evaluation of each article, although some will warrant a future, perhaps more thorough review, I thought it would be interesting to identify the nut in each article and why it is wrong. So in the spirit, but not the intellectual rigor, of Generation Rescue's 14 studies, let's sort through the nuts. Number 1. Tobacco plants will now make vaccines. By Joseph Mercola, D.O. This is less about misinformation and more a nut of fear-mongering. One of the ongoing problems with the flu vaccine is the lag between the hopefully correct identification of the year's influenza strain and the production of the vaccine, taking about 9 months to come to fruition. Each dose of flu vaccine is grown in a single chicken egg, so the infrastructure required to produce all those eggs and support that one poor chicken is huge. That poor chicken has probably not sat down for a year. What has been needed for years is a rapid, simple, and inexpensive method to generate huge amounts of flu antigen for the vaccine. Genetic engineering has made the production of human insulin and bacteria routine to the benefit of every insulin-requiring diabetic. The benefit of inducing viral genes, but not the whole virus, into plants could be the ability to generate huge amounts of cheap vaccine. The other benefit is that plant infections cannot infect humans, making the vaccine theoretically safer than vaccines grown in animal cells. It reminds me of the old joke, do you know why a neurosurgeon is the only miracle doctor? Because it can turn an animal into a vegetable. As Mercola sums up, quote, keep in mind that if you place your sole trust in your health officials and vaccine makers, the potential price you might pay is your physical health and financial future. Cue the prairie dog. Everything is at stake. In my opinion, blindly believing that a plant-based vaccine will remove the possibility of viral contamination and potentially deadly side effects is foolhardy at best, end quote. Fortunately, vaccine producers test for viruses and other contaminations, so we do not have to rely on blind belief. Fortunately, for those that have a MasterCard in their wallet, he then lists a number of alternative flu treatments and preventatives that ever so kindly link to Mercola.com, where you can ever so conveniently purchase his products, many of which do require blind belief for efficacy. What gets me is that I'm the big pharma shill. Look out Mercola, because number 2, our second nut, is Whom Do We Serve? The Medical Doctor's Conundrum by Suzanne Humphreys, MD. The nut at the center of this essay: doctors are profit-driven tools of big pharma and the government. Quote, the creativity of the caring profession has been systematically choked to death by the pharmaceutical industry, the AMA, and the government, who have been waltzing together for over 60 years. I don't think anyone's waltzed for over 100 years. Young, bright college grads do not go to medical school with any understanding that the system they are embarking upon destroys health rather than cures it. They are about to become pawns in a system set up for commerce, with human beings being the means of putting the check in the bank. I've never seen a waltzing pawn. I suppose Dr. Humphreys doesn't take money from her patients to treat them, because that would be using human beings as a means of putting the check in the bank. Dr. Humphreys, however, knows that natural treatments are being suppressed since they cure the patient, and if cured, the patient would no longer need a doctor, eradicating the income for the medical industrial complex. I presume, if the above were true, that her practice is like that of an infectious disease doctor with no long-term patients, because I cure the majority of my patients. She continues, quote, removing heavy metals from the body is considered a risky and potentially dangerous intervention that is shunned and avoided by mainstream medicine, even though it has been done safely for over 30 years by alternative practitioners. I guess she doesn't read the death from chelation articles. This is an interesting paradox, since many of the diseases that doctors treat are related in some way to heavy metal toxicity. Hypertension, heart disease, various neurologic diseases, cancer, and kidney failure. Could it be that addressing the cause would eliminate the need for the cure and for the doctor? End quote. I presume she's unemployed. Heavy metals? I thought all cancer were due to a liver parasite. I believe Dr. Mercola suggested as much. Could it be that heavy metals are related to, none of the diseases mentioned? And the reasons that doctors ignore heavy metal is that they are not an etiology of disease? Or perhaps doctors prefer light jazz. The suppression of truth for financial and other reasons is a popular refrain in the alt-med community. I have no understanding of this bizarro outlook on the medical community, as I am not sympathetic to conspiracy theories. I work in an environment where everyone is doing their best to make people better and to prevent illness. Since many of the alt-med practitioners seem to profit directly from selling the products that cure the alleged diseases they diagnose, it is yet another example of holy kettle calling the pot black, Batman. I sure wish I could make a buck off the diagnostic and therapeutic interventions I recommend. The third nut. What to do about all those non-vaccinating parents by Robert Sears, MD. The nut at the center of this essay, the CDC is covering up information about parents vaccinating children. Quote, I believe the CDC has been trying to hide the fact that more and more parents are refusing or delaying vaccines. End quote. I guess Dr. Sears doesn't read all those articles about decreasing vaccination rates. Oh, wait, he can't read them because the CDC is suppressing them. Or that is his belief. And that is the standard of proof at Medical Voices. I believe. These are often reference-free essays, but why would one want reality to get in the way of belief? This essay is another example of conspiracy fear-mongering. Now, I believe that the CDC is doing no such thing. So who are you going to believe? My belief or Dr. Sears' belief? Who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? His proof? None. I have spent an inordinate amount of my career discussing and reading about the declining vaccination rate as part of my job in infection control. And more often than not, the source of my information is the CDC. I guess if they are hiding this information, they are doing a lousy job. Or perhaps Dr. Sears, like so many at Medical Voices, doesn't know how to do a Google search. Number 4. Censorship and Show Trials on Vaccines and AIDS by Donald W. Miller, Jr., MD. The nut? Dies is a cola nut. Dies is an uncola nut. You guys remember that? Or am I that old? What follows is not a parody, but a direct quote from Medical Voices. Quote, Peter Duesberg and Andrew Wakefield are two tenacious, brave men. They struggle against the medical government pharmaceutical complex's efforts to disenfranchise them, and they have endured a withering barrage of ad hominem attacks, but they do not flinch in their efforts to see truth reign. Duesberg with AIDS and Wakefield with vaccines. One hopes that in the not-too-distant future, both of these truths will pass through Schopenhauer's third stage and become accepted as self-evident. Once fully accepted, the pandemic of autism spectrum disorders and the chronic diseases that now afflict so many children, asthma, allergies, arthritis, enterocolitis, and diabetes, will abate. And AIDS by prescription, AIDS caused by taking antiretroviral drugs that doctors prescribe to HIV-positive people, DNA chain terminators like AZT and protease inhibitors, will cease. The day will come when the CDC withdraws its childhood immunization schedule and stops recommending that vaccines be given to children under 2 years of age. HIV tests will no longer be done, and antiretroviral drugs will be outlawed. End quote. Dr. Miller knows the truth with a big T. Or perhaps Mr. T. I pity the poor fool who thinks AIDS is caused by HIV. Unfortunately, Wakefield lied, and Duesberg is simply wrong. There are almost 300,000 articles on HIV and AIDS on PubMed, representing perhaps 1 million authors, demonstrating remarkably sophisticated understanding about both the biology of HIV and its complication. To think maybe 1 million HIV researchers and physicians are all working together to keep Peter Duesberg's truth suppressed. Wow. My career started with the HIV epidemic. That's association, not causation. And I have watched the evolution of our understanding of the disease and its treatment. We have gone from a 9-month life expectancy to an almost normal lifespan thanks to HIV medications. To suggest HIV is not a cause of AIDS, but that, quote, the real cause of AIDS is fourfold: heavy-duty recreational drug use, antiretroviral drugs, receptive anal intercourse, I will make no Freudian references here, and malnutrition, end quote, is an interesting interpretation of the medical literature. I am glad Dr. Miller is a heart surgeon. So's Oz, come to think of it. And especially glad that he will never be my heart surgeon. Again, I keep thinking of DC Comics' Bizarro World, where everyone on that square planet, spelled HTRAE, does the opposite of what is done on the real Earth. Many of the Medical Voices essays could have been written on Bizarro World. The trials and tribulations of Dr. Wakefield have been well covered on Science-Based Medicine. I would wonder if, however, rather than measles or autism researchers, it had been Dr. Miller's financial advisor who had exhibited the same behaviors as Dr. Wakefield, inventing information for investing and then bought Enron for him. Would he be so understanding when he lost his 401k, calling his advisor a tenacious, brave man struggling against the banking, government, investing complex? I somehow doubt it. Number 6 on our hit parade of Medical Voices essays, Smallpox Vaccine, The Origins of Vaccine Madness. The first 2/3 of this entry are a recounting of the early history of the smallpox vaccine. It is an entertaining read, but not being a historian, I cannot vouchsafe the information. At no time in the essay, however, does the author bother to note that the vaccinations of Jenner's time, which was a transfer of smallpox-laden pus, is not the same as the modern vaccine production techniques. And then it gets weird. There has been no human smallpox in the world since 1976. There are many other pox viruses, a family of related viruses that preferentially infect a different host. There is cowpox and monkeypox and squirrelpox. The cowpox was used in the vaccine to eradicate smallpox because there is enough similarity between the two viruses that infection with the cowpox virus prevents infection with smallpox. But there is enough difference between the two pox viruses that it is very rare for the cowpox to spread beyond the inoculation site. The fact that there has been no smallpox since 1976 is, it would seem, reasonably good evidence that there is no longer human smallpox in the world and that the vaccination was the cause of its eradication. However, Dr. Craig has a clever solution. Her nut, smallpox is still around, but it's been renamed as either chickenpox or monkeypox. Really, that's her theory. The essays on Medical Voices induce a need to qualify that the quotes from this site are the real deal and not meant as a joke on my part. This rationalization is akin to saying that the dodo is no longer extinct. It has merely been renamed the chicken or the turkey. Both, after all, are flightless birds. I don't even think they could come up with something like this on Bizarro World. Number 7. Pandemic Panic Hits the World Health Organization by William Campbell Douglas II, MD. The nut, the H1N1 flu epidemic, was faked by the WHO to sell drugs and vaccines. This article was published in February 2010, and the idea has had a resurgence of late thanks to the British Medical Journal. Now, everyone who's an infectious disease doc, such as myself, learns about the pandemic of 1918-1919, which killed maybe 40 million people worldwide and 600,000 in the United States. We worry that one day a new strain of flu will emerge with the right combination of virulence factors, and there will be a repeat of 1918. Luckily, we dodged that bullet with the 2009-2010 pandemic. The H1N1 was highly infectious, but fortunately, relative to other flu strains of the past, it was not very virulent. There were an estimated 61 million infected people. Hard to make up 61 million infected people. 274,000 hospitalizations, and about 12,000 deaths by CDC estimates. Deaths, like the 1918 pandemic, predominated in the young, under 65, and the pregnant. Elderly pregnant people were protected. I always like the way anti-vaccine proponents belittle the mortality and morbidity of vaccine-preventable illnesses. Quote, "I'm sure by now you've noticed the swine flu is nothing more than a sniffle," unquote. 12,000 deaths, a sniffle. For a short period of time, my hospitals, just as the flu season peaked, were maxed out. We had no beds, we had no vents, and there was a worry about how we were going to find the staff and space to treat patients if the increase in flu-related admissions continued. And then, poof, their rates fell instead of increased. I have never leaned so far over the edge of a precipice before and been pulled back from what appeared to be a disaster. It still amazes me months later. Now, I saw 2 related deaths. H1N1 was more than a sniffle for them. 162 million doses of vaccine were produced and distributed, but only 90 million were given. So maybe 60 million cases of flu were prevented from the 90 million shots given. If that's indeed the case, then the vaccine could potentially have saved 12,000 lives. Of course, people in public health are always screwed. They will either underprepare or overprepare for a disaster and get blamed either way. They didn't do enough and people died, or they did too much and wasted money. The solution? I think we should fill the WHO, probably the WHO, and the CDC with psychics. Miss Cleo should be in charge. And we can just call her for her free reading now. Okay, now we're up to number 8. Forced Vaccinations, Government, and the Public Interest by Russell Blaylock, M.D. There is the philosophical political question as to whether the government has the right to force vaccinations. It is not a scientific question. The questions of safety and efficacy are answerable by science. Part of this essay is philosophical, and Dr. Blaylock evidently blames vaccination policy on, well, I feel kind of odd saying this because it seems so, well, weird. But he blames the Rockefellers for vaccinations in the U.S. Really? The Rockefellers. And you thought renaming smallpox was strange. Quote, the Rockefellers either owned outright or had controlling interest in all the major pharmaceutical companies. This has given them absolute and extremely powerful access to the reins of power at all levels, yet they can't be defeated by the truth. End quote. So, last century, could we at least have a suggestion of a modern conspiracy like, I don't know, reptilians? Because I, for one, bow down to my lizard overlords. I did find some websites to suggest that, in fact, the Rockefellers are high-order reptilians, so I cannot dismiss this argument out of hand. Repeat after me. In the context of this essay, nut is metaphorically referring to, quote, a hard-shelled fruit of some plants having an indehiscent seed, unquote. And I'm sticking with that. As to the science, his major contention is that herd immunity is a myth, and proceeds to make a series of calculations to prove that herd immunity is indeed a myth. He combines all vaccines, each with different efficacies, as if they all have the same efficacy. There are several characteristics of anti-science, anti-vaccine writers. They do not like change, they do not like subtlety, and they like their topics to be all or nothing. His basic argument is that vaccine response has been discovered to fade with time. Also, I might add, water is wet and fire, it's hot. Since we do not have outbreaks of vaccine-preventable illnesses in the population who have faded immunity, herd immunity therefore must be a myth. What a surprise. He fails to take into account that fading antibody levels do not necessarily mean fading ability to respond to infection, since many who have been vaccinated will have an amnestic response to the infection. They will gear up antibody production after re-exposure faster than if they had not been vaccinated. Then there's also behavior, nutrition, hygiene, and understanding of disease that has helped decrease spread of illness compared to the outbreaks. But like most anti-vaccinators, I still need a better term. Vaccinators. Terminators. Probably been done. It's probably copyrighted. Either the vaccines are 100% or they are nothing. Like many anti-vaxxers, terminators, he fails to understand or chooses not to consider subtlety and nuance. Part of vaccination results in vector control. For example, vaccination of children with the conjugated pneumococcal vaccine has led to a marked decrease in invasive pneumococcus in the adult and elderly population. So targeting disease in one population can prevent disease in another non-immune population. However, waning immunity is an issue with pertussis, and the reservoir for disease in children is vaccinated adults whose immunity has faded. But there is sufficient immunity to prevent whooping cough. Reality is always more complicated and nuanced than the fantasy world of the anti-vaxxers. The rest of his argument, quote, the fact that powerful, enormously wealthy foundations such as the Ford Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the Rockefeller series of foundations are supporting forced vaccination greatly enhances the power of governments all over the world, end quote. And world is a capital W. The big irony from my perspective is that an important issue with vaccines is the ease with which people can get an exemption. I looked for statements from the above foundations to see if I could find recommendations for forced vaccinations. All I found was the statements of Dr. Blaylock. But of course, that is what the Rockefellers want me to write. Shh, don't let anybody know. They are out to get us. I know this argument appeals to some, but I don't get it. This seems so fringe it should be on a Surrey. Watch that fringe. See how it flutters. That's from Oklahoma, by the way. Talk about obscure references. Next is number 9. Number 9. An unwelcome third wheel. Patient vaccination without doctor authorization. They're not really good at their metaphors here. I'm not certain how vaccination is a third wheel, but anyway. The basic nut of this essay is that vaccinations are routinely given in the hospital to patients without a doctor's specific order. This is true of many hospitals. I have long been a big proponent of these policies in my institutions at the behest of my Lizard/Rockefeller masters. Part of the quality indicators of hospitals is to make sure that all patients have both the flu vaccine and the pneumococcal vaccine. The secret to quality care, as I have discovered over the years, is that you have to take the responsibility out of the hands of the physician, since more often than not, in a busy, complicated day, they may forget. It is only when we have taken the responsibility out of the hands of physicians who are focused on acute problems and make vaccination routine has compliance with numerous quality initiatives improved with a subsequent, I want to emphasize this, marked decline in infections and mortality in my hospitals. Dr. Humphrey, however, says, quote, you are not in control anymore. I know it's the outer limits. Your patients can be harmed by vaccines you have not ordered while your back is turned, end quote. As I read the article, and I may be interpreting it incorrectly, while the policy had been in place since 2007, she discovered the policy in 2010. Evidently, while her back was turned, she was not paying a whole lot of attention to what was going on in her hospital. She continues, quote, guidelines, recommendations, and one-size-fits-all treatment programs for all comers for the sake of profit were the real driving forces, end quote. It is not mentioned, and I can only speak here for infectious disease guidelines, that in virtually every study published on outcomes, populations who receive therapy based on guidelines, recommendations, and one-size-fits-all treatment programs have decreased mortality and morbidity compared to populations where the treating doctor does what they want. We follow these guidelines because they make patients better. Patients do better when physicians follow the guidelines. Of course, I do not suffer from the hubris and arrogance that the doctor is the be-all and end-all in patient care. I've always considered the practice of medicine to be a team undertaking. And for others, it's just an undertaking. First, we get the renaming of smallpox. Then, the Rockefellers. And now we have number 10, shaken baby syndrome and non-accidental injury. Are patients and caretakers being falsely accused? Okay, Shaken baby syndrome is where the baby is shaken violently. This causes trauma to the child, including retinal hemorrhages, fractures, soft tissue injuries, and occasionally subdural hematomas bleeding into the brain from a whiplash injury. The nut of his thesis is that these effects are from vaccines, not trauma. It is not the abuse of the child by the parent, but rather the vaccines that have led to what appears to be trauma. At least he didn't suggest it was caused by the Rockefellers, but I would not necessarily characterize this as an improvement in critical thinking. Bleeding in the brain. Trauma? Nah. How could trauma cause bleeding? It must be the vaccine. This has to be the oddest argument in a site filled with odd, and speaks for itself. But it is nice to know that those who injure children, inadvertently or advertently, if that's a word, have an advocate. The vision statement of this website says, quote, "The International Medical Council on Vaccination will become the most comprehensive educational center on the internet for physicians seeking the truth about vaccines. This will change healthcare as we know it." End quote. I will not disagree. If they succeed in getting baby shakers off by blaming vaccines, it will be a change of healthcare as we know it, but it will not be for the good. In case you're wondering, we're at the halfway point. I got 20 of these, so if you've got to get up and use the bathroom, now's a good opportunity. As we move on to number 11, flu shot. Friend or foe? Guess what they think. The nut here, vaccines do not do anything and are filled with toxins. I bet half the essays are variations on this theme. She states that flu only kills 1,000 people a year. That's the direct influenza deaths, not 30,000, which are by and large indirect deaths. They have formaldehyde, not bothering to mention that everybody produces 1.5 ounces of formaldehyde a day thanks to normal metabolism, and the vaccines all have less than 0.1 milligram. Nothing new here. But the author of this essay is not noted for her ability to read. She says, quote, "Manufacturer's package insert indicate that the flu shot should not, capital N, capital O, capital T, be given to pregnant women." End quote. Well, if you look at the package inserts for the flu vaccine, they all say something to the effect that vaccines should be given to pregnant women only if clearly indicated. All right? I do not see a "not" in any of the package inserts, just the usual lawyer-driven cautions. That pregnant women are more likely to die from influenza does not seem to be a concern, nor is checking her statements for accuracy. I don't know. I get the sense that the only way the writers in this blog can make an argument is either to ignore pertinent information, make up information, or misrepresent information, or all the above. Number 12. Stop all vaccines! ! Mars wants women! ! The nut here is, quote, recommending more and more toxic vaccines and belittling arguments against vaccinations. Such behavior can only occur when profit, creation of illness rather than health, and population control are priorities. Now, it's easy to belittle things when they are totally unrelated to reality. But population control? If you want population control, then getting rid of vaccines would be a better approach. Dead people, after all, do not reproduce, zombies notwithstanding. I recommend vaccines because they are safe and efficacious. Vaccines have been the single best bang for the buck, decreasing morbidity and mortality with surprisingly few side effects. I bet Dr. McIntosh doesn't use airbags because they kill maybe 25 people a year, probably do not save lives, and are in cars only to generate profit for Big Auto. Don't get me started on seatbelts. Lucky number 13 is awarded to Dr. Sherry Tenpenny and her essay, A Heretic's View of Influenza's Role in Health and Disease. Dr. Tenpenny is a germ denier. Disease is due to toxins that damage the body, and the germs subsequently take advantage of the toxin-damaged tissues. She even quotes the well-debunked lie that Pasteur recounted his germ theory on his deathbed. Again, fact-checking is not the strong point of Medical Voices website or its authors. Again, what follows is a direct quote. I remain afraid that someone will think I am making this up at an attempt at parody. So please, look it up yourself. Quote, it may be that the role of bacteria and the virus is to induce an inflammatory response, a low-level modified cytokine storm to help the body to detoxify. It would be very interesting to test the secretions that are expelled during a bout of the flu for chemicals and heavy metals. For example, if a person reportedly died from, quote, viral pneumonia, end quote, perhaps the body was trying to expel a huge amount of chemical-containing mucus. If the person's immune system was too weak to muster the adequate response, or his lymphatics were too congested to drain the accumulated debris, and the more chemicals are added during the acute episode, such as aspirin and antibiotics, anti-inflammatories, and steroids, the body may well have become overwhelmed, leading to the person's demise. In the presence of faulty detoxification processes, toxic overload occurs. Maybe microbes are handy to have around, inflaming the system and cleaning out the muck. If everything is here for a reason and there are no mistakes, perhaps an episode of the flu with the increased mucus, cough, nasal drainage, and diarrhea is an act of cleaning out the internal dross. Supporting the body through this elimination process with homeopathy, herbs, and Chinese medicine, instead of suppressing the symptoms with Western medicine's tools, may be the key to long-term health and longevity. From this perspective, bizarro world, instead of being the problem, viruses may be part of the solution, the, quote, cleanup crew, end quote. It should be noted that the human race evolved because of its relationships to microbes, not in spite of it. What a novel thought. Instead of fearing the flu and doing everything possible to avoid it, including spending billions of dollars to create an experimental vaccine, it may be okay to spend a week or two in bed, clearing out accumulated toxicities. I'm sure many will think this is heresy bordering on the ridiculous, end quote. This is not heresy. It is ridiculous, bordering on ludicrous, down the street from preposterous, kitty corner from farcical, and across the street from absurd. The homepage of Medical Voices has the phrase, medical doctors convey the results of thousands of hours of study, end quote. I am not certain what they are studying, given that many of the entries do not have references. But the information above is not based on any references found in PubMed, except, of course, on Bizarro World. Dr. Tenpenny plants another misinformation nut with number 14, The Truth About Flu Shots and Pregnancy. In this essay, she musters data to suggest that pregnant women should not get the flu vaccine. She, of course, leaves out of her data was mortality. She oddly fails to note that mortality was exceptionally high in pregnant women from H1N1. Fortunately, pregnant men were protected. Complications and deaths from vaccine-preventable illnesses are relatively rare in a large population. Dr. Sears, at the end of his vaccine book, says something to the effect that he is glad he has never cared for cases of the rare morbidity and mortality from vaccine-preventable diseases that his infectious disease colleague contend with, because he might otherwise be more in favor of vaccines. Ignorance, I guess, is bliss. This is another characteristic of anti-vaxxers. If they haven't seen a death or a complication, then mortality and morbidity of an illness does not matter and does not exist. About 30,000 die each year in car accidents, and another 30,000 die from being shot. Now, I have never had a personal acquaintance die in a car accident or be murdered with a gun. Yet I wear a seatbelt, I do not own a gun, and my kids are vaccinated. I'm counting them down, coast to coast. This is number 15, unvaccinated children. And remember, everybody who writes articles are doctors. Most are MDs, some are DOs, and a few are NDs. Boggles the mind. This hypothesis is that the diseases are not that bad, and if they do occur, well, you should treat them with homeopathic nostrums. Again, a dismissal of the suffering and death because it is uncommon. And he goes so far as to suggest that, quote, likewise, any child whose sibling or parent previously contracted polio or had a severe or complicated case of measles or whooping cough or any other diseases listed should not receive the vaccine prepared against that illness. Given that many severe reactions to infections may be the result of various polymorphisms in the immune system that result in a genetic predisposition to illness, if a sibling had a bad course of illness, then it may be all the more important to prevent it in the unaffected sibling with vaccination. I have seen tetanus. It is a nasty disease. However, he recommends, quote, hypericum, Hypericum, can reputedly treat as well as prevent tetanus. But I would recommend giving human antitoxin at the first sign of the disease, since it is far less effective later on, end quote. I do not know whether to laugh or to cry. I'm at 15 entries. Can I keep going? I have yet to read a single reality-based essay with valid information. What's next? Mercola again. This one is caused flu vaccine exposed. The nut here, the flu isn't that bad. The vaccine doesn't work, and all you really need is vitamin D. Flu influenza, he notes, caused, quote, just 1,100 actual flu deaths, end quote. Another just. He don't seem to care that people die. Now, I have discussed flu mortality at length on the Science-Based Medicine blog. I'm not going to argue against the importance of vitamin D as an immune modulator and the importance of being replete in vitamin D to help decrease the chance of illness. But note the absolutes. Vaccines do nothing. Vitamin D is all. In my world, one of nuance and subtlety, vaccines and vitamin D both help to variable degrees. Number 17 is the always popular protecting yourself against the swine flu. Another oversimplification. Quote, and where do they get these ideas? The flu vaccine is supposed to cause a cytokine storm, and this inflammatory overreaction is what causes the damage, not the virus itself. Only partially true. This is interesting because all vaccines also cause a cytokine storm, one that can last for decades. This is why vaccines are linked to sudden death, joint pains, depression, weakness, fatigue, mental cloudiness, seizures, neurologic disorders, and autoimmune diseases. No, it's not. No one seems to be concerned about vaccine-caused cytokine storms, which are, in fact, immunoexcitotoxicity, end quote. No, sorry, wrong. Wrong, and wrong again. Cytokine storm refers to the massive release of cytokines that accompanies an overwhelming and often rapidly fatal disease. And, by the way, the flu does directly damage cells. It will rip your lung cells to pieces. Influenza is a hurricane. Vaccines are, in comparison, a light spring shower that comes right after you've sown the grass seed. Cytokine storm. I do not think it means what you think it means. There is zero evidence that vaccines cause a cytokine storm, much less a storm that lasts for years. Where do they get these ideas? Studying thousands of hours of what? And for number 18, we are back to Joseph Mercola, D.O. Now, I know a lot of DOs. Our hospitals are filled with MDs and DOs, and the DOs are fine doctors. However, every time I see the initials here, I want to pronounce it dope. Kind of, Homer Simpson, which I can't imitate. Here's the nut of this essay. Quote, Nigeria has been facing outbreaks of polio that are caused by the polio vaccine itself. The nation has faced at least 7 separate polio outbreaks caused by a mutated virus of the polio vaccine. Now, this is true, but he leaves out key information. What a surprise! Dr. Mercola, who's against vaccines, leaves out important information. What happened in northern Nigeria is that they were on the verge of eradicating polio when Islamic clerics decided that the vaccine was being used to spread HIV and sterility in Nigerian Muslims. The clerics told all Muslims to stop taking the polio vaccine. Now, the live polio vaccine is used because it results in a superior response compared to the killed vaccine, although it rarely, about 1 in a million, can cause polio. Also, Africa has many immunoincompetent children thanks to HIV and malnutrition and a less than optimal sewer system. This not-so-perfect storm allowed the polio vaccine strain to persist in the environment and spread and mutate. And as it mutated, it became more virulent, causing polio. The number of cases of wild polio has dwarfed those of the vaccine-related disease. As the vaccine compliance has increased, the number of cases of wild-type polio has gone down, as has vaccine-derived polio. But you would not know the rest of the story from reading Mercola. It is a shame that Paul Harvey has passed on. Medical Voices could use him as an editor. Quote, in the past 10 years worldwide, over 10 billion doses of oral polio vaccine have been administered to over 2 billion children. There have been 9 outbreaks of vaccine-derived polio virus in 9 countries, in communities with low oral polio virus vaccine coverage, resulting in 200 polio cases. During the same period, more than 33,000 children were paralyzed by wild polio virus, while over 3.5 million polio cases were prevented by the vaccines. Vaccine-derived polio has been rapidly stopped with 2 to 3 rounds of high-quality immunization programs. End quote. Of course, Mercola has the answer to polio. Quote, according to one study, a substance produced during the sugar refining process, such as deoxy sugars, may be responsible for polio. Even if polio virus is present in a population, you are not likely to get it unless you consume large quantities of refined sugar. End quote. Yes, of course, the developing world, where polio is rampant, is noted for its large consumption of refined sugar, yet the United States, which has almost no sugar consumption, has no polio. According to the WHO, Nigeria consumes 9.5 kilograms per person each year of refined sugar, compared to 31 kilograms in the United States. I guess that explains why the U.S. has so many polio outbreaks compared to Nigeria. It's all the sugar consumption. Finally, an article that I have no comment upon. It's number 19, Virus de Influenza Tipo A Porcina by Victor A. Marcial Vega. The reason I have no comment is I do not read Spanish. So, for all I know, it is a totally legitimate article. There is, however, one curious sentence in English in the whole article. Quote, use an all-natural antibiotic for viruses such as colloidal silver, unquote. I always tell my kids that you can judge a man by the company he keeps. So, let's say I am not optimistic about the veracity of this essay. Congratulations, you have made it to number 20, the final nut. Profits, not science, motivate vaccine mandates. The hypothesis behind this particular essay is the real reason docs push vaccines is they make money. Quote, vaccines represent an economic boon for pediatricians. Profitable well baby visits are timed to coincide with vaccinations scheduled established by the AAP and the CDC. Right. Of course, they'd make more money if the well baby visits did not coincide with the vaccine visits. But there was an article in the journal Pediatrics that looked at the net financial gain or loss from vaccination in pediatric medical practice. And they found, quote, we conclude the vaccination portion of the business model for primary care pediatric practice that serve private pay patients results in little or no profit from vaccine delivery. When losses from vaccinating publicly insured children are included, most practices lose money. End quote. Enough said. Well, I've now done 20 essays, and I have grown weary of the contents of Medical Voices. 19.1, again, I don't know what's in the Spanish article, essays filled with half-truths and misinformation. But in the spirit of openness, I will say the Rockefellers paid me to say that. I had naively thought I could evaluate the whole website, but it was too tough a nut to crack for one entry. There were many more essays to evaluate at Medical Voices. I will get to them one day or another. And that ends the Quackcast number, whatever number this is. Medical Voices. Always in error, never in doubt. Don't forget, you can find my growing multimedia empire at moremark.squarespace.com, where you can find a PayPal button that you're more than welcome to click upon. However, and I know you're not, more importantly, go on iTunes, write me a review, a glowing review, because my ravenous ego demands it. See you next time. Talk to you later. Bye-bye and bye bonds. Well, Mr. Rockefeller, how was that? Is that what you guys needed? Good. Aim to please. Yeah, don't worry. The record button's off.